Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and taking time out of your day to spend with us. We're going to start the webinar in just a few minutes. I see there's a lot of participants still rolling in. So we'll give you all just a quick second to join us here. And while we're waiting, Justin, what is the thing that you're seeing outside of your window right now?
I am calling in from New Hampshire right now, and it is pouring rain here. So hopefully the weather is better for everyone else.
Not quite pouring rain here, but it is a little overcast. Not particularly sunny right now. So
It's a good day to talk about governance, Lisa.
it absolutely is. All right, I'm going to give one more minute before we start. But while I'm waiting for that minute, what I'll do is I'll kick us off with a bit of housekeeping, just so everyone knows we are recording the webinar. So you will be able to actually share it and access it should you want to share this with other colleagues or review anything that we do talk. And of course, your questions are really welcome throughout the event. We want to make sure this content is for you, that it's useful for you. So please go ahead and type in your questions in the Q&A. We'll try and answer them real time, but we do have a Q&A section at the end if we need to get there. All right, so let me get started here. Quick introductions. I'm Lisa Aguilar. I'm a VP of Field CTOs and Product Marketing. And with me, I have Justin Swansberg, who's our VP of Applied AI Experts. He works hand in hand with some of our largest and smallest clients and their data science teams, helping them both with their generative and their predictive AI journeys. So he's seen it all. If you have a problem or an issue that you are running into, he is a great person for you all to ask questions about and really get his insider knowledge on how others are tackling some of these issues and challenges. All right, so a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to give you a quick introduction about DataRobot because, of course, we have to, and my marketing team would be very upset if I didn't. But then we're going to jump into the meat of the content. So Gartner and the critical capabilities. We'll spend a little bit of time on what they have been evaluating vendors on. If you haven't seen it already, there's a Gartner Data Science Magic Quadrant that has been released. It's been a long time coming, so we can spend a little bit of time talking about it. And then some of the changes that are happening right now. So things that you should be aware of that you may or may not know, and just making sure that we're all level setting on like why governance is such a hot topic today. And then giving you a couple of elements for how to build a strong governance foundation if you don't already have that in place. Definitely a place for you all to ask questions and really hear about best practices. We'll go through a little bit about DataRobot's governance umbrella, a quick demo, and then we'll end with a bit of a case study on terms of Cisco and their generative and predictive AI at scale and how they're approaching governance with us. All right, so let's get started here. About DataRobot. So DataRobot is a pure play AI and machine learning platform focused on generative and predictive. You can say that AI is in our DNA. We did not become an AI company. We've been focused on nothing but machine learning before generative AI even hit the market or people were really as excited as they are today, which does give us a bit of an advantage in terms of the market. It means that we've seen all the tough problems that data science teams have to face, and we haven't shied away from them. So our platform has truly been battle hardened for delivering real world value for all of you and helping you on your journey through multiple different tools and options that we have available for you. I think some of my favorite things about DataRobot is our platform really is a platform of choice. We are seen as a critical infrastructure, not only with our strategic partnerships, but with our customers, so much so that we've had a tremendous amount of economical, societal, and organizational impact. So in case you didn't know, 1/3 of the foreign exchange actually goes through DataRobot. That speaks to not only the quality of the models that DataRobot is building, but the security and the performance of models long term. We also were heavily involved with the NIH in terms of leading the pandemic vaccine trials and modeling site analysis, literally using AI to save lives. We've also been used at border control in terms of preventing and predicting drug trafficking across borders. And then most importantly, we also have over 1 million AI use cases that have been created and actually embedded into organizational processes across organizations. And of course, we are humbled to be recognized by our customers and the market as our AI machine learning platform of choice. A little bit about DataRobot, if you don't know us already, think of us as sitting as that system of intelligence that sits between your system of record and your system of engagement. What we are is not a collection of tools. So really focusing on giving you that streamlined enterprise gate pipeline so you and your teams can actually focus on what's important. creating really good, high quality machine learning or generative AI applications, and then making it very easy to get those embedded into your existing business fabric. Extremely composable about DataRobot, so very flexible in how you want to work and the way that you want to work, and very open as well in terms of all the tools that you want to be able to bring in. We're really focused on helping you work the way that you need to work and be able to get AI out into the organization to drive that impact. And of course, we're helping you unify all that governance and control so you don't have to worry about it. You can just do the things that you know how to do particularly well. And most importantly, we are not a walled garden, but we are completely open and portable. All right, so let's get into the meat of this. DataRobot has been considered a leader, not only in the data science Gartner Magic Quadrant, but also we were rated #1 for governance in the critical capabilities in Gartner's evaluation. And a couple of things that Gartner really called out in terms of DataRobot that helped us get this recognition was really the fact of our deployment options. So DataRobot is one of the only vendors that can actually be deployed on-premise, on bare metal, in a private or public cloud, or accessed as a managed service. So the flexibility and the security that you need is there, built out of the box. We have some very strong strategic partnerships that make this very much a turnkey initiative if you are needing to work in an on-prem environment. Our platform does cater to both code-first and low-code users. We do have a code-first experience, and we have multiple areas of that functionality for build, operate, and governing data science and machine learning models. Now, some of the things that Gartner has called out in terms of their critical capabilities that are very specific to DataRobot is our ability to extend our capability of handling machine learning models very easily into generative AI. This goes back to what I said earlier. Because we're founded in doing nothing but AI, generative AI is not something that's totally foreign to us and being able to help you manage it effectively and create really high quality applications. And this includes model experimentation capabilities across cloud LLM playgrounds, giving you that flexibility and option to really choose and pick which LLM is actually going to be best for your use case. Our ability to extend our model registry to applications that are generative AI applications, if you have some that are built that you need to actually register and see, and then our monitoring and observability for LLMs. Some of the critical capabilities and scores that we actually scored the highest on were some of our features that include our feature store, our distributed training, our experiment tracking, our deployment and serving, and monitoring and observability. So DataRobot, out of a score of 5 from Gartner in terms of their critical capabilities and evaluating all of the vendors, you can see we scored extremely highly on the entire pipeline in terms of AI machine learning, both for predictive and for generative. And of course, this is just one industry recognition that we have received. We are a 4-time AI leader across all of the major industry analysts, from Gartner to 451 to Forrester Research, as well as SBI Insights and more. All right, let's get into the meat of things, governance. Why should it be top of mind for you today versus anything else? Well, there are 3 key trends that are actually really accelerating governance and making it top of mind, not only for CIOs, but also for data teams. So if this isn't something that's been top of mind for you, I'm sure you're hearing about governance a lot more. And the 3 key things are AI regulations are rapidly changing and evolving. We're going to go through some of them. Some of them you may have heard, the EU AI Act, but there's some that you may not have heard, and there's some that are definitely emerging that you should be aware of, independent of what industry or state or geo that your organization is actually working in. The other thing that's happening is Gen AI has definitely put a spotlight on what is happening in terms of the deficiencies of legacy processes and infrastructure processes when it comes to AI machine learning. So we're going to unpack a few of those things and then give you some tools on how to think about them differently. And of course, generative AI has led to an exponential increase, not only in who can build, but who can consume AI. And this is also changing what it means to effectively govern generative AI in your organization. So let's dive into the regulations aspect. Now, you may know these, but there are 3 major regulations that are happening across different unions. The UK has its guiding principles for responsible AI. The United States has federal regulations, if you're a federal entity or body or working with the federal government, that you have to adhere to. But there are also a smattering of state and local laws that are actually starting to emerge when it comes to AI regulations. And some of these you may know in terms of local laws in New York City, some data privacy laws in California, New York, Connecticut, and then there's Stop Discrimination of Algorithms Acts in DC. And then, of course, there's the EU AI Act. So even if you're not an organization that's actually based in the EU, but you may be doing business in there, and you are going to be making offers to people based in the European Union, you do have to adhere to the EU AI Act regulations. So it did finally pass Parliament in March. There are some timelines that you do have to hit. So there's a bit of a grace period to try and get your regulatory or house in order in terms of being able to meet the requirements there. But they have some very strict requirements. So transparency and disclosure, the impact assessment, the data governance, some of that human oversight that's required with AI, and of course, the technical documentation and record keeping. You also have to look at the system performance, security, and dissemination of summaries of content for training. So this requires very heavy, very intensive documentation that's consistent across your modeling process. Now that sounds probably like the most boring thing to do if you're a data scientist. Like, who wants to actually document models? You're wanting to actually build things. So we're going to talk to you about how to actually make that less painful for you while still giving you all the tools that you need to be able to adhere to these regulations. Now, what's different is if you're not an entity that's actually doing any work in the EU and you're just North America based, it's actually going to become quite more complicated for you, to be honest. It's because we have no federal mandates or regulations that each of the states is actually creating its own patchwork of AI regulations. So if you are doing any work across state lines, or you're based in a certain state and you're only doing work in there, you are having to adhere to new regulations that are popping up. So a new one that just happened in Colorado is the Consumer Protections in Interaction with Artificial Intelligence Systems. Utah has its own Intelligence Policy Act. Tennessee has the Elvis Act, which is very fitting. I do like that acronym. At least you'll remember it if you're living in Tennessee in terms of what kind of acts they have to take. This one is taking place in July. And then California, they have regulatory enforcements. But in addition to some of the state and local laws, there are new AI regulations that are actually popping up across industries as well. So healthcare, there are new regulations in California that are looking at any healthcare provider that is using AI and machine learning that has to adhere to very similar transparency and documentation regulations that have been very much embedded in financial services orgs. And if you don't have that in your company today, it's how do you bridge that gap, prevent it from actually interfering with your AI initiatives, and keep you on track. Insurers have another one. So 7 states are now adopting brand new AI rules to have insurers have to be compliant. As you can see from this article, that is quite a significant lift. So the big takeaway that I want you all to understand, especially when it comes to governance, is it doesn't matter if you're not in a certain union or region or geo that isn't regulating at a very high level. State and industry laws are happening. They're happening very quickly, especially with generative AI. It's accelerating the pace of these new regulations that are happening. And you should be taking a very proactive stance on how you're building out your governance, your framework, your usage, your documentation, and trying to standardize on it now so that you don't have to worry about getting caught off guard with any of these regulations. So in short, they are coming for you. Whether they're here for you now or not, you are going to have to adhere to them at some point in the immediate future. So better to get your house in order now. All right, there's also the other trend of what generative AI is doing in terms of putting a focus on the deficiencies actually that exist in today's processes. Now, I know this is probably not something we all want to hear. We are the best at what we do, right? We've got the best pipelines, we've got the best governance, but the sad reality of it is that these current processes actually aren't working for generative and predictive. So according to Gartner, only 10% of generative AI solutions have actually made it into production. And a lot of this has to do with that confidence gap. And I'm sure you all have felt this pain when you are creating your generative AI applications. Do I feel confident in the responses? Do I feel confident that my generative AI solution is going to stay on topic and protect my brand? And this is a different weight that data science teams have had to hold that they haven't had to be responsible for, which is truly the brand reputation and security risks that are really embedded into how you actually build your generative AI applications. But generative AI is really only highlighting some of the process gaps that currently exist in the current machine learning process. So if you take a look on the stat on the right with McKinsey, over 90% of machine learning failures are actually from poor production practices. So this has nothing to do with generative AI. This is just fundamentally that a lot of emphasis has been placed on building machine learning applications. And then we have these very fractured, very hard ecosystems in which AI needs to actually get embedded to that aren't standardized in terms of piping. We don't have standardized tooling in place, which makes it very difficult to create these very enterprise grade resilient pipelines that are actually built and can adapt to both the needs of generative as well as prevent some of these ML failures. Now, Justin, I know you work with a lot of customers and clients. You've seen some of these failures. What have you seen in the real world?
One big trend that we're seeing across our customer base is that most folks, when they're deploying these newer applications, they're actually combining both predictive and generative. In fact, I think that's the example we're going to walk through with Cisco at the end of this webinar. And why that's important is that you can't just have two totally isolated governance processes, one for predictive and one for generative. You've got to actually monitor and enforce them in a single centralized location, especially when both of those technologies are combined to power a single application. The other thing that we're noticing is there is a different demand or a different set of requirements for proper governance as far as generative is required. So yes, this does not diminish whatsoever the importance of setting up a really robust governance process for predictive, but you're going to need to add and extend to that when you incorporate generative too.
That's exactly right. And if we look at the next slide, I think the one thing to call out is mainstream platforms really are not making this job any easier. I know many of you have probably felt that like hand-to-hand, code-to-code combat that you're having to deal with every time you build a model, and then you're trying to get embedded into your business applications. And this is just for each of the standardized tool. And I'm sure many of you are working across different cloud platforms. So you may have some of your data in AWS or Microsoft or GCP. How are you standardizing your governance, your build, your project pass-through across all of those things? So the other trend that's starting to happen in terms of putting AI governance front and center is really that exponential increase in who can build and who can productionalize and then who can consume AI. Now, when it comes to generative AI, there are an explosion of AI practitioners actually hitting the market. Now, I know as data scientists, you're probably like, wait, but we know how to build it. We understand the nuances of it. This is very true. You understand that once you put a model into production, that it is going to have a very different life of its own. There's monitoring, there's retraining, there's other things that need to happen. But there's a whole wave of generative AI practitioners that are starting to come in that are a bit hobbyists that may be actually doing this in your organization today. Because the reality of it is building a generative AI application isn't as complicated. You basically need a bit of coding, understanding, and applications. So we see a lot of IT teams, a lot of software developer teams actually creating generative AI applications. But unlike what they know when it comes to software, software doesn't erode once you put it into production and start misbehaving based on the data that it's seeing, and you can quickly bug fix it. When it comes to generative AI, it's very different. So they don't understand a lot of the full life cycle best practices that all of you inherently know. So we're seeing is a lot of shadow Gen AI actually popping up across organizations. Now, Justin, I know that you've seen this in terms of building generative AI not being difficult.
So I think what I probably want to call out here is that there, across all the customers that we work with, so many internal teams building out prototypes. Because even though generative AI presents its challenges, it is really easy to get something up and going. A lot easier, in fact, than many of the predictive models that we used to see. So having a standard set of these processes or a governance framework is even more important because there's going to be way more folks across your organization that are trying things. And the other big challenge that we've seen is generative, you actually have to evaluate the solutions in an entirely different way. It brings with it a far more subjective nature. You can't, for example, measure the performance or forecast how well your model will generalize because you don't have some objective ground truth data set. a lot of what it means for one of these models to be robust in practice actually requires humans in the loop. And something that Lisa, for example, thinks would be acceptable output might be entirely different than what I think might be acceptable output. So you've got to actually stand up an entirely different assessment and evaluation framework as well.
It's true. And that's just the bill part. When you look at consuming, I'm sure many of you have finally everyone's like, I understand what AI is with generative. They're probably coming and asking you all, can I get a generative AI application? What generative AI has done is it's lowered the bar of understanding what the impact of generative AI can have on a business user, which means it's easier to use. It's easier to request information. That means more people actually want access to it. And that is an access oversight challenge. So before you had to really worry about data lineage, and like making sure your models were put into production in the right places. Now, if you're building generative AI applications, it's who has access to that information. Are they accessing the right information? How do you build those firewalls against it? How do you ensure that the right people are doing the right things? I mean, there are some malicious bad actors inside of your organization as well. So as you broaden the scope of who can actually access and interact with your generative AI applications, are they doing good things? Are they doing nefarious things? Again, more weight on data science teams to actually look at how they're managing and how they're building generative AI applications.
That one other thing, Lisa, a lot of folks have really fully developed MRM processes. So if you are trying to deploy or productionize a predictive model, everyone's probably fairly familiar with the set of steps and the compliance documentation they need to produce to get that approved internally. We are still very much in the early innings of creating the analog for that in generative. And that's been a big area of investment for us internally. And I know there's been a lot of demand and appetite for it across our customer base. What are the set of steps I need to work through and document? What are all the different scenario testings and stress tests that we need to run to ensure that we've got the right amount of confidence to actually deploy a generative model as well?
Which is a perfect segue for building a strong governance framework. So here we are getting to the meat of things. Justin, you teed us up perfectly. Why don't
Yes.
you walk us through this?
So why don't we dig in a bit here? This is one of my favorite charts. And the idea is that in order to actually set up a proper governance system, there isn't a single silver bullet. To make sure that you catch all the different failure modes that generative can bring, you need to set up what we call multiple lines of defense. And we actually refer to this as the Swiss cheese model, where each of these slices of cheese is one different screen or filter. It's a line of defense that you can set up internally inside your organization to actually catch some of these failure modes, either before a model is advanced to production or after you've deployed it into production. So if we double click into what each of these are, and Lisa, you advance the slide for me, we can start with the first line of defense. And this is really your internal team. All the different ways that you can incorporate humans in the loop to actually stress test your model, make sure that you've got this fairly objective set of monitoring and evaluation criteria so that you can ensure your model checks the box before you move it into production. And this is what I mentioned earlier. It's really difficult because with generative, you don't have that clear ground truth held out data set. You can't say, for example, I know that the expected error or the log loss of this model, if I were to put it into production tomorrow, is going to be X. You need a completely different framework. And oftentimes that actually involves soliciting feedback from folks internally about the quality of your generative solution. From there, the second slice of cheese is the risk management. And this is more of a holistic process, but it's everything that you need to set up all those different check boxes that your model needs to work through before you're actually comfortable pushing it out into production. So this could be all of the appropriate metadata. It could be the internal system of approval. What are the hoops that you need to jump through? Who needs to actually sign off on this particular model? And then what are all the different metrics that we need to collect and then make sure we monitor in production so that we actually can clearly say this model is failing and needs to be addressed, it needs to be retrained, it needs to be redeployed. And then the third and final, the internal audit, is making sure that once these models are actually pushed into production, I think this is the biggest gap that I've seen, that folks are actively monitoring it. You need to be collecting information about how your end users are consuming these generative solutions And you need to have a lot of metrics that will actually actively monitor the responses that these language models are providing, or that your generative systems are providing, so that you can easily go back and audit all the different questions and answers and make sure that nothing has changed between the first and second lines of defense here and the third one once the model's out in the real world. So if we were to better understand what this means, I know this is a bit of a chart here. It highlights the entire life cycle, the process you need to go through to actually develop some of these generative systems. And what's really important to think about governance is that governance doesn't just apply to that final model. When you create a lot of these frameworks and processes, you need to actually create them specifically for each step of the ML lifecycle. So there's a separate set of these checkboxes that you need to make sure that your team has fully covered during the training process. And then when you move from training to evaluation, you need to incorporate and monitor a second set. And then when you take that model and deploy it into production, you need to have yet another step. So it's important to make sure that you integrate these early and often, and then you've got these different sets of standards across the entire lifecycle, from build, deploy, manage, and monitor. And then finally here, we go on, pass it back to the next slide. For the governance standards, so we just talked about how we need a separate set of these different systems or processes, but let's actually take a little bit of a deeper look into how this works within the DataRobot platform. So down below this umbrella, you see build, test, production, and management. All of the sub bullets here, that's really what I mean by you need to make sure you've got these governance standards that are specific to the actual actions your team is working on. So as an example in build, you need to make sure when folks are developing solutions that you've carefully collected and collated all the different lineage and tracing. You need to make sure that you've got the appropriate set of permissions. You know who was working on the various build stages. You know what versions were changed and what changes took place in the underlying versions. For testing, once you actually push these out into production, do you run through the same standardized CI/CD process? Do you make sure that you've run some of these stress tests? A really big gap that I've seen out in the field, folks tend to try and evaluate their Gen AI system by asking some representative set of questions. You can imagine we've got a chatbot, and typically the questions that your team can create are often fairly different from how end users, or the types of questions that end users will actually ask. So it's got to be some combination of the questions that you anticipate, but you need to be resilient and actually expect some entirely different questions. That's sort of the analog of stress testing for predictive models. What happens if you get an anomalous entry? Well, folks can ask anomalous questions, and you need to make sure that the answers are still in accordance with your policies. And we'll really spend time in the demo diving into the latter two ideas here, the pillars, the production and management. You need to make sure, like I mentioned earlier, that you've got a single standardized system that can monitor both predictive and generative models, including applications that leverage both generative and predictive at the same time. And you've got to have a set of guardrails or safety checks that actively monitor all the different incoming inputs, so typically questions that users will ask, as well as the different ways that these models can respond, all of the output. So what I want to talk about before we actually dive into the demo, there are three different ideas, and a lot of these you'll see play out in the actual DataRobot platform. The first one is adding a governance layer with approval workflows and the appropriate metadata for every model or workflow that you develop. The second one, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, is the idea of these compliance documents. They are a really familiar concept in the predictive space, especially in highly regulated industries, but folks are still working on creating an industry standard for how this type of compliance should work for generative models. And then finally, there is all of the observability and tracking once a model is moved into production. And the really key piece here isn't just the ex post monitoring or visibility to let you know what happened. It's actually setting up what we call moderation or intervention so that your systems can actively intervene. If you catch something that is problematic, rather than having that user's question make its way all the way to the language model, or even worse, having a problematic answer be returned to one of your end users, you've got to catch that in transit and moderate it. So if we click into the very first one here, the govern aspect, inside the DataRobot platform, anytime anyone across your organization is working on an asset, be it predictive or generative, we have a single pane of glass that will centralize all this different work. So you can understand or get pretty good insight into who is working on what and exactly how they're building it. This is all the metadata that I mentioned, and it helps because you can layer on top of it all of the appropriate permissions. So you get a sense of who is building what, and you can build off of that these approval policies to make sure before someone takes what they prototyped and advance it from dev to UAT or UAT to prod, you can ensure that it works through a predefined set of steps. So the right folks come in and sign off on that advance from, let's say, dev to UAT, or they sign off on the advance from UAT to prod, and you keep a log or a history of exactly when these models were promoted, who promoted them, and then who signed off on those approvals. If we click into that second pillar, compliance documentation, I mentioned that we've been spending a lot of time creating the analog for the predictive experience. And typically, if you're in a highly regulated industry like insurance, financial services, banking, you're probably familiar with the fact that every time you deploy a model, you'll have to, along with it, produce sometimes up to 300 pages of documentation. Everyone, because there's so much potential risk, is really careful to ensure that all of the different potential failure modes are well outlined and they're all written down in advance, as well as all the appropriate mitigation strategies. We've added this in for generative as well. So again, if you are deploying a model to production, it does not matter whether that's powered by predictive, generative, or both. You'll be able to look through what we call automated compliance documentation that will not only outline all the different pieces you pulled together to create the actual application, it'll also run a lot of out-of-the-box stress tests or scenario analyses and produce a lot of generative specific metrics that can help you understand the quality of your results. So if you're working with text, audio, video, there's an entirely different framework you need to apply to ensure that your results are aligned with your expectations. Is the tone right? Is the verbiage right? Is the answer correct? Is it well justified? Is there any harmful or toxic language? Even something as simple as fairness and bias is entirely different in this generative world than in predictive. So at the end of the day, none of these answers are deterministic. And then finally, once all of this work is done and the model has been approved and pushed to production, you still need a system set up that can actively report against how these applications are being used in production in real time. The worst thing you can possibly do is push one of these models into production and have absolutely no insight into how your end users are interacting with it and the quality of their responses. So we provide a dashboard where users can either select our out-of-the-box guard models, or what we call our monitoring capabilities, or they can author their own, anything that is specific to their use case. So this gives them two things. One, really good insight into what's happening. It's a way to aggregate a lot of these generative specific metrics on a dashboard that you can look at over time. But two, and I mentioned this earlier, it allows you to set up this active moderation. So if you catch some type of problem or failure in production, you don't have to live with the fact that poor answer or incorrect answer or even harmful answer makes its way back to your end users. You can actually catch it in transit and moderate it. So you'll block it from ever making its way back to your end users. In fact, here is a screenshot of what that looks like. This is one of those dashboards. We'll actually walk through something similar in the demo as well. In this case, though, you can see each of these little modals or widgets, a different metric we're monitoring in production. And it is really up to you to decide what metrics you want to monitor and whether or not you want to apply moderation. There's a few different categories, though, or flavors. So the first one in the top left here is actually the ability to use predictive models to help actually evaluate or assess the quality of the answers or identify any issues. I think DataRobot is uniquely positioned to combine both predictive and generative. In fact, you're probably tired of hearing me just say those two words. On top of that, you can actually use language models or non-predictive models as guards as well. You could want to, for example, track the confidence of some of the scores or your answers. And here you can see highlighted sentiment. You might want to understand what the overall tone or the positivity or the negativity is of all your responses, and then be able to drill in after the fact to highlight some of the poorer quality or more negative responses to make sure that when you run a lot of these retrospectives and you're trying to perform some root cause analysis, you can drill right down to the original problem. And then finally, we're always really careful to make sure we solicit and capture feedback. In all of those cases, though, even if it's human feedback you want to incorporate, the key is the ability to layer on these moderation or this moderation. So what you're looking at here in the screenshot is how a user who has built one of these production systems can actually come in and customize which of these guardrails or metrics they want to apply to the incoming questions or prompts and the outgoing answers. So for all of our systems, we encourage our customers to actually set up a standard. So for every model that your team plans to push to production, here are the 6, 7, or even 8 different guards that should be attached to ensure that we're comfortable pushing this out into the real world. And these could be simple models that check for leakage like sensitive or confidential information, any PII. They could be models that detect prompt injection. And they could be models that check for relevancy. Oftentimes, when you set up these systems, you test them in a really refined setting. You expect they're going to ask questions relevant to what the chatbot, for example, was built to answer. But there's no guarantee of that once you have an end user and a chat interface. So you can make sure to limit the scope of all of these questions to just things that are relevant to the problem at hand. And then finally, if we move on, DataRobot offers a gallery of these out-of-the-box guards. And so you can actually choose between any of these 4 different high-level categories. We sort of separate them out into cost, safety, quality, and correctness, and attach any of these different guards to your pipeline. So think of it like wrapping around some of those slices of cheese that you saw earlier, each of which is meant to detect or catch a different failure mode in production. And how this actually works in practice, once a user sets one of these up and chooses to either apply the guard to the inbound or the incoming prompt or the outgoing response, you'll actually have that guard model sitting around filtering all of the incoming users' questions. So in this case, if we have a PII guard and someone accidentally or even knowingly discloses some confidential information, we will catch that before that information is ever leaked to the language model and then block it. So on our system, you can actually customize the response and the moderation message and prevent that data from making its way outside your environment. And then similarly on the response side, if you want to detect something like a low quality or poor quality or even digressive response, you can choose to apply that as well to the output from the language model. So in this case, we've got a number of different guards that will detect hallucinations or incorrect, inappropriate responses. And again, before the end user sees that failure, we'll actually catch it, and you can add logic to either moderate the response or just ask the language model to correct it in real time. And then finally, to wrap on this before we hop into the demo, all of this can be tracked from that single dashboard I mentioned, where you not only get to look at some of these metrics aggregated over time, you also get to drill into any of these potential problems. So every time one of those guards triggers an alert, you'll actually be able to come in here and anyone can review, well, what was the particular question that triggered it and what was the moderation strategy, which is super helpful for making improvements to these systems. But it's also helpful when you want to look backwards and understand the root cause of some of these issues. You can imagine with a chatbot, you may have folks complain about the quality of answers. And if you get a support ticket or an inbound complaint, you'll want to go revisit the exact history. So making sure that you actually capture and maintain a trace log or a history of all the interactions with your systems is critical. Oh, right. I know that we're coming up on time here, so maybe I'll do a really quick tour, and I want to make sure, Lisa, you've got at least a minute or two to walk through the Cisco example.
Yes, we also have a lot of great questions that are coming in, so keep those up. We're trying to answer them in the background, and we will try and address them live as well.
All right, so I want to show off a little bit about what all this looks like in the actual platform. And I'm going to highlight a handful of different screens just to give you a flavor of what DataRobot can support. Here, we're looking at what we call the console. Think of this like your centralized command center, where we're actually going to document, catalog, and monitor all of the different machine learning models in production across your org. So you can see in this example account, I've got 31 active deployments. And across all of them, I can actually track different measures of health. So here we've got service health, data drift, and accuracy. But you can also double click into each of these different models here to understand if there are problems, what's the actual problem, and how can I go about mitigating that problem. So if I come in here, and this is one of the last things that I'll show, I can double click into one of these models. You'll see a description, all the metadata I added, the fact that this successfully went through our approval process. And we also carefully document all the related items that we had to bring together to produce this deployment, as well as any of the runtime parameters or even logs over time. This is that traceability. So if someone comes in and ends up actually replacing or substituting a newer version of this model, we want to understand who actually made that change, when it happened, and the reason it happened. In fact, if we actually pull up the underlying model in this case, you can see that we carefully track all the different versions. And when you double click into one of the versions, we will allow you to actually kick off and monitor a variety of different tests. This was one of the other lines of defense we mentioned, where you can easily revisit past tests and set up a standard for all of your models to go through that they need to pass before you can, in fact, push these into production. So this was a really quick high-level tour of how some of these governance capabilities are brought together in the platform. It's really just scratching the tip of the iceberg here. There's a lot more beneath it. I think the point that I really want to emphasize, though, is every time someone works on one of these machine learning problems in a DataRobot platform, we're really careful to make sure that we actually catalog that particular interaction so that you can always go back and revisit it, which means if you get a problematic answer in production, we have a trace log for it. You can go back to the exact response. You can understand what the guard models or how they valued it, why it was or wasn't caught by one of the screens, and recreate that scenario. So with that, I will turn it back over, Lisa, and give you all of 2 minutes to walk through our customer example.
I'll do 1 minute so we can do 1 minute of questions. I know you all keep typing them in and we're trying to respond as fast as possible. So Cisco is a longtime customer of DataRobot. They have multiple predictive models that they've built with us. And you can imagine the scope and the scale of Cisco. They probably have every single cloud data warehouse. So they have a very kind of hybrid environment, lots of security that they need to have in place. We built a couple of predictive models on their customer use cases and examples. What we've done is we've wrapped those predictive answers inside of a generative AI application to make it even easier to access that information. So this generative AI application, think of it as almost like a customer 360 app. It's used by thousands of their success managers at their customer engagement level, really looking at helping to predict the next action, understand the quality of the customer experience that they're having, ensure and prevent churn, help to highlight some new features or new functions that may be most relevant to the customers, and really creating that hyper-personalized experience. So as you can imagine, Cisco has to adhere to multiple different regions, regulations, and different requirements with DataRobot that been able to standardize and unify that process, being able to expand who can actually build predictive models within DataRobot, bringing all those teams together, and then really letting them do what they need to do, which is actually create high quality AI applications and get them in the business fast. All right, so we do have some other assets for you. There's a lot of questions. So Justin, I'm just going to dive in straight into the questions. There was one on somebody in Germany on the call. Thank you very much for joining us. I know it's very late for you in the public sector. Very strict requirements in terms of data access, security breaches for training AI models. What are some of the ways that we've dealt with that? And Justin, I know you've had a lot of experience working with federal and governments inside of the US and around. So what are some of the ways?
Yes. One of the biggest things is, for us at least, being able to maintain the flexibility of running a lot of these models locally and making sure that you're using pre-approved models. Earlier, Lisa mentioned some of the newer regulatory frameworks, and we've even seen some large companies like Meta and Facebook actually slow down or limit the release of some of their newer models out to the EU just because the regulatory climate is so uncertain. So having the ability to adopt models that have been approved and when necessary, running them locally so that your data won't leak out to third-party platforms has been particularly key, especially with some of the sovereigns that we work with and the governments.
Yes, and so we have two solutions there. We do have our A&M box solution. So if you have Nutanix, just think of it as a turnkey directly on premise for you, but you can also deploy DataRobot on premise, which is a big reason why we work with very highly regulated organizations. There was a lot of questions on attacks to AI bots here. Are attacks to AI bots a real thing now with generative AI? What are we going to hear around this? And the answer is yes, you're going to hear terms like jailbreaking and prompt injections. That's just the new wave of AI reach and security. So unfortunately for a data science community, this is, again, a new skill, something else that you're having to add to your belt in terms of how you're having to manage it.
And this too, Lisa, is where the relevancy comes into play and super important. You've probably heard a ton of examples in the press of how folks are offering these chatbots, but they're being misused. In fact, people are using a lot of these chatbots online as almost their own personal chat GPT. So the ability to actually parse questions and block any questions that aren't related to the organization or the underlying intent of the use case is super helpful. And that not only blocks some of this poor usage, but can also catch some of the other issues you mentioned, like jailbreaking and prompt injections.
There's also some questions about our ability to integrate with existing tooling. Once we get those alerts that do happen, can we forward some of that information or integrate it in with other tools like IT systems management tools or SIEM tools?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that you just saw and everything that we talked about in the slides is all accessible through our API, and we also support WebSockets as well. So it is bidirectional, and if you have your own dashboard, let's say it's in the visualization tool or some third party you're using, you can easily lift and shift all the information that we capture and port it over to that other system. It's fully open.
Great. A question here, does DataRobot track all experiments, parameters, and metrics?
Yes, absolutely. So we do our best to track as much as we can out of the box to save you the time, but we also have a highly flexible process where you can quite literally track any parameter, hyperparameter, or experiment you would like.
Right.
And that's not just the actual, sorry, Lisa, not just the parameters of the model from the build side, it's also all of the governance related parameters as well. Who actually worked on building it? What was the approval process? Who signed off? When and how did it move across the different stages of the life cycle from UAT to dev to prod, everything under the sun.
Perfect. only have 2 more questions. We'll go rapid fire. And then I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to your questions here. We will follow up with you though, so your questions will not go unanswered. How does it work with conversations in Spanish, Justin? Or in that was a specific example, but other languages, how well does DataRobot work?
Yes. So out of the box, we make sure that we don't just ship our platform with models that have been trained or overfit on a single language. And there's three ways that we handle that. One is when we have one of these single, more generic models, we run a lot of internal testing beforehand to make sure that it gives highly accurate, high quality answers across a range of languages. Two, we make sure that we ship separate models as well that are language specific. So in some cases, some of the standard models just don't work as well out of the box when you switch from, let's say, English to Arabic. And there are a lot of models that were trained specifically on some other languages. So we make sure to ship those as well. And then third and final, we make it really easy for you to bring in any other external asset. So if you have some model that you've fine-tuned internally, or a new one comes out, let's say Cohere or Anthropic or OpenAI release it, you can immediately that day bring it into our platform, and you'll get along with that all the different governance frameworks. So we're totally agnostic to the underlying language model.
All right, and then last 2 here. How do we track transparency of the data in the generative AI platform? So tying that output back to a response. The question is really about creating the licensing relationship in this context, or that lineage.
Yes, one thing I did not show you in the actual demo was every time someone interacts with your end generative system, we make sure to save that interaction down, and you can actually investigate it right directly from the platform. But we'll give you the ability to click into all those different question answer pairs. And we actually take it a step further and provide some analysis so that you can understand what are the different types of questions that users are asking, or show me all the questions that have negative or poor user feedback. Show me all the questions where one of your guard models flagged a hallucination, and then help me understand what additional documents maybe your RAG pipeline is referencing for context when you end up with one of those poor decisions. So there's a bunch of different ways to layer on some analyses that we support for any of your generative pipelines that let you dig a lot deeper into the actual ways that folks are interacting with your system.
Great, thank you. And I'll just quickly wrap us up. What types of governance workflows come in the platform? We highlighted a few of them earlier in the conversation. So definitely go back and take a look at the recording in terms of our governance umbrella, as well as the actual process management. We can optimize that and integrate it into your existing MRM process. We have multiple financial institutions that have very specific regulatory requirements, as well as government institutions and other regulated institutions that we have to adhere to, so highly flexible. There are a lot of questions about these Gartner reports that I have here. We will be sending those out in a follow-up email to you along with this recording. And then the last one was, what are the glaring differences between model risk management for predictive models versus AI models? So Justin, that's the last one, and then we'll close out.
Perfect. There is a long, long list, but I would say the major difference is that with predictive, you already understand the range of inputs and outputs, and you're mostly dealing with numeric responses that are deterministic. With generative AI, there is no guarantee of determinism. So we need to make sure that you understand the variety of different, or the universe of potential questions you can ask these systems, or images and videos you can send. Because if you really change some of the input, you'll get potentially drastically different output. And then 2 is to understand a lot of, on the response side, how that randomness can actually impact the quality. So for these stress tests that we run, you need to add in a bunch of metrics that will review or assess the quality of images, video, and textual responses, which you typically don't need to for standard MRM processes, because again, you're outputting numeric answers.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for joining us and staying all this time with us. We spent a little extra because we had so many questions coming in. It's good to see that governance is top of mind for all of you. It is critical, and it's going to become more and more important. As Justin said, you only a tiny fraction of what DataRobot can do. I do highly recommend you book a live demo one-on-one so you can explore that much more in depth and see the full capabilities. And thank you again for your time and joining with us. We enjoyed spending it with you all. Have a good one.